So we've talked about our motherboard and we've talked about some of the different components we have on it. Now we want to actually dive deeper into the individual parts on the motherboard and the different types of the individual parts. First thing we're going to talk about are actually our expansion slots. We have a couple different types of expansion slots, so let's take a look at them and see what we can learn. The first slots, which are very useful, are known as PCI slots, which are our peripheral component inputs. These slots, of course, come in different sizes, and the first one we want to know is our generic PCI slot. We have 4 of them on this motherboard, and as you can see, the PCI slots have a small nub in them. That nub is there because different PCI slots may have different voltages. We have our 5 volts and we also have our 3.3 volts. As we can see on this particular slot, we have our majority of our portion of our slot to the left and our small segment to the right. This indicates to us that this is actually a 5 volt slot. And that nub there prevents us from placing, say, a 3 volt card into the slot. If our situation was reversed and we had our small section to the left and our large portion to the right, then that would actually be our 3.3 volt. Now, when I say left and right, this is looking at the board with our input-output to our left side. And that's how we can tell the different left from our right on our card here. The next PCI slot that we want to look at is our PCI-X slot. PCI-X is actually a 64-bit slot, whereas our PCI was only a standard 32-bit. This means that we can actually get 64 bits of information simultaneously across this connection rather than just 32 bits of information simultaneously across the connection. It's faster and, as you can see, larger, which gives it a greater surface area for that information to get through. Now again, these PCI-X are similar like with the PCI, where they have different voltages. The last version of PCI that we have are going to be our PCIe slots. We don't have any PCIe slots on our board here, so we have another board here. On this, we notice we have 2 PCIe slots. These come in different sizes. There are PCIe 1X, 4X, 8X, and 16X. And that is actually how many times faster it is than just the X1. So the X1 versus the X16 is going to be 16 times more bandwidth going across this slot than across the X1 slot. As you can see, the X16 is much longer, whereas the X1 is just a small slot that we have here. If you have an X1 card, but only X16 slots, the X1 cards will fit into the X16 slots. But obviously it won't work the other way around because the X1 slot is a lot smaller and the X16 cards won't even fit in there because of their size. So just so we have it written down, we have our PCIs, our PCI-X, and our PCIe for PCI Extend. We also have additional slots known as AGP slots, which stand for Accelerated Graphic Port. On this motherboard, we can actually see we have an AGP universal slot. There are no blockers, so this AGP can fit either voltage, and it can just slide right in there, and this provides us space for additional intensive graphics ports. Now, the AGP are a little bit more intense, we'd say, than the standard PCI slots, because the AGP ports can actually borrow system memory. So it can borrow a little bit of memory and it can use that in order to render, say, 3D graphics for intense games that need the 3D graphics, or say designers who need to have video cards which are intensive for them to get great color spectrum and good 3D designing abilities. They'll need to be able to borrow a little bit of that system memory in order to render those 3D graphics. And that's what AGP cards allow them to do. So we see we have an AGP universal slot there. And then a little bit more restrictive, we have our AGP 1.5 volt slot here, which has a separator, which restricts which cards we can put in there to prevent us from putting the wrong type of card in. And then we have our AGP Pro slot. You'll notice that the AGP Pro slot is significantly larger than a standard AGP slot. This gives us the ability to put in AGP Pro cards, which are bigger cards and sometimes more intensive cards. And you'll also see there's a small sticker here which prevents us from putting cards incorrectly into this slot. A smaller card will still fit into this slot, but the sticker keeps us from offsetting it incorrectly and misaligning the pins. However, if we do have an AGP Pro card, we can remove this sticker so that we can place the card in. But if we aren't using the AGP Pro slot, then we want to just either replace the sticker or maybe put a little bit of tape or something over that to prevent us from misaligning pins. So the next actual slot that we're going to look at is going to be our CNR slot, which is known as a Communications Network Riser slot. We have one on this board. Our CNR slot used to be a different slot known as an AMR, which was an audio modem riser. Now we use it just as a CNR slot, and the CNR allows up to 6 channels of audio support. So sort of like the AGP was our accelerated graphics port, our CNR port, our Communications Network Riser, allows us to have better audio channel support. So we have 2 more ports to add onto our list here, our AGP and our CNR. You'll definitely want to review all of these different port types and know what they look like and what the differences in them are, and especially what their speeds are and what the differences between, say, the X1, X4, X8, and X16 versions of the PCIe are is when you come to the A+ exam. These will be testable questions, and it's good to know them even if you've already taken the test and you're using them just for more troubleshooting knowledge and tech knowledge when you're installing cards. If you get the wrong card and you don't have the slot for it on your motherboard, then that card is now just sitting in the box. Our last slots that we're going to look at on our motherboard aren't for input or output. These are actually memory slots. These don't provide us with additional spaces for sound or accelerated graphics. These slots are actually where we place our RAM cards, which we have an example of here. Our RAM cards go into these slots and are locked into place by our levers here. Now, this one looks offset, and rightfully so, because it's not the correct card to go into this slot. But for demonstration purposes, I was finagling it a little bit. However, these cards slide into the slot and then are locked into place by the levers. Remember, on a computer motherboard, we never want to force cards into slots, because a lot of times, especially when we're working with small computer components like this, if we have to force something, it probably means we're going to break it. So we want to be gentle with cards, we want to be gentle on our motherboard, and we want to put cards in properly, like so. The card was turned backwards, so the pin's misaligned and we couldn't put it in. But when we flip the card around, we now have the right orientation for the card, and we're able to place it in. If we would have forced that card in, we would have broken our memory card, or even worse, we would have destroyed the pins on our slot, and we wouldn't have been able to use that slot anymore. And if we needed all 4, then we may have had to replace the motherboard. These memory slots may have different amounts on them, and depending on the motherboard, can only support up to so much memory. Just because we have 4 slots doesn't mean we can take 4 8-gig memory cards and put them in there and end up with 32 gig of memory. Our motherboard may only support, say, up to 4, may only support up to 6. It depends on the type of motherboard. So we want to make sure that we do that research before we spend the money on the larger cards, so that we're using the right card, not only in number of pins and size, but also the right cards as far as their capacity on the motherboard. Again, these memory slots, the RAM slots, are going to be located usually in general proximity to your CPU, because the CPU, your central processing unit, and your memory cards, your memory slots, talk all the time. So we've gone over our slots on our computer, or rather our motherboard, and we have all of our input-output slots, our PCI, PCI-X, PCIe, AGP, and CNR. And then we have our memory slots, which are not input-output slots, but they are additional slots on our computer, or rather our motherboard, that we plug memory cards into. So they're good to know. So we'll move on to our next topic, and we'll talk a little bit more about a different computer motherboard component.